cultural imperialism and the new yellow peril in Western classical music. I actually wanted to ask you, how did this symposium come about and why did you feel it was important to host this event?
Yeah, well, I'm really delighted that you came, and there were
Yeah,
so
it was a
many
great
people
event,
who
really
came.
thought provoking.
We were really, Cherie and I were both really energized by the response that we got, and the turnout on the day was fantastic. We also had a lot of responses from around the country and abroad, actually, of people who wanted to come. I think I remember saying to Cherie, I think this is the first time that there's been an event of this kind to look at the role of Asians in particular, but also minorities more generally in classical music and in music education in this country. And I remember we had a discussion that it was quite surprising. In the US, there's much more of a discourse around Asians as the model minority. And, you know, often if you go to a music school like Juilliard or Curtis in the United States, you'll find so many Asian students, in some cases more than 50% Asian students. And we simply don't find those kinds of numbers in Europe, especially when we look at places like orchestras. And so we thought it was important to draw attention to the fact that there are so few Asians represented in European orchestras, and we don't have this discourse of the model minority and a history of immigration as there is in the US. And there's, of course, much different narratives and different histories here in Europe. But simply the fact that the identity of Asians had not been discussed as an academic topic and a focus in itself. So our title, Cultural Imperialism, really referred to the idea of music, specifically Western classical music, as a universal language, and how powerful that ideology has been, and its ideas have exerted so much power over the cultural capital of, if we can call it that, of classical music. And we felt that it was still a form of imperialism in a cultural sense, that Western music has exerted a hold over the way that we look at music production in classical music. Most of the composers are dead white men. And so how can we include more women? How can we include minorities? That's kind of where we came from. And the second part of the title, The New Yellow Peril, came from this idea that often Asians are seen as invaders. Invaders, by definition, we don't belong in a space.
And the racialized stereotypes, I imagine, surrounding skin color as well.
That's right. Yeah, there are stereotypes about the way that Asian musicians play. A very common one is the stereotype of the automaton.
Yeah.
Or as the Germans say, technisch ohne Gefühl, so technical playing but without feeling. Yeah, so some of my research has been in Germany, and I found that this robot or automaton stereotype is prevalent in many countries. The idea being that Asian faces are inexpressive, and similarly, Asian interpretations are devoid of feeling. And I find it a problematic stereotype. It may be that there are some Asians who play robotically. I'm sure we know some, but there are also musicians of every hue who play robotically. And to extrapolate from that it's an Asian problem, I think I do find racially charged. It was to draw attention to these kinds of issues and to really get a conversation started that we convened the study day last June. We've got a collaboration planned with some colleagues in the US who have already started on this path of looking at the role of Asians in classical music and in music education.
In light of the recent news, I think that many of those issues, they've taken on, I suppose, a new potency.
I mean, we've all been dealing with
George Floyd.
Yeah, exactly, the Black Lives Matter movement and the incredible energy that has come up through protest and resistance to police brutality in the States and problems like mass incarceration. These are problems that are not new, but that have been highlighted. I'm sure you know because of your expertise in social media that it's the era of being able to point a phone at something and taking a video and making it public so easily on YouTube and other venues like that. I was watching a documentary the other day that the civil rights movement also harnessed social media in this way, that it was the new medium of television in the 60s that helped to bring public attention to the civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. So in a way, these kinds of issues of systemic inequality have existed for years and years and are themselves the legacy of inequalities stemming back generations and which have made their mark on history. And so for a historian like me, because I consider myself first and foremost a music historian in my academic work. I mean, I'm a violinist as well. But from a historical point of view, the oppression of minorities and unequal treatment is nothing new. No, is really nothing new. And it's heartening to see more of a movement that has bubbled up around George Floyd, the terrible murder of George Floyd. And I am encouraged by the intention that these kinds of events and protests have brought to the need to address systemic inequalities in all aspects of society, including institutions and including areas as rarefied as classical music. And so the kinds of research subjects that I've been dealing with tend to be, let's not forget, the more privileged, mostly musicians from affluent families who are able to afford music lessons and afford instruments. And as unfair as the practices are that I've uncovered in the classical music world, in many orchestras, not all, but many orchestras who have a history of tending not to hire Asian musicians, for example, because of these stereotypes that we discussed earlier.
Mm.
And as unjust as these things are, it's not as if these musicians are losing their lives because of their skin color. So we have to be very clear about the scale and the consequences of inequality, and not to lump all inequalities together into a monolithic category. At the same time, I do think that work on inequality and addressing the need to give more voice to minorities in society fuels other efforts of the same nature. And so I would like to see much more solidarity between the activists who are working for equal rights for Asians and the Black Lives Matter movement, which is so terribly important for our times.